Before we dive into one of the most astonishing geographical discoveries in Australian history, I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching this from, and if you've ever stood in a desert, or any place so vast it made you feel absolutely insignificant. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why that feeling matters. Now, imagine this. You're standing at the edge of what maps once called the dead heart of Australia, a place so hostile, so unforgiving, that even the indigenous peoples who thrived everywhere else on the continent treated it with profound respect, crossing it only when absolutely necessary, leaving no permanent settlements in its burning core. The year is 1930, and you've been tasked with something that sounds simple on paper, but is actually borderline suicidal. Map the Simpson Desert. Chart every mile, every feature, every geographic characteristic of 170,000 square kilometers of what everyone assumes is just flat, endless sand. Your colleagues back in Adelaide think you're mad. Your family wonders if they'll ever see you again. The newspapers call it a fool's errand. Why map emptiness? They ask. Why count grains of sand? But you're not going there for glory or recognition. You're going because someone has to know. Someone has to understand what really exists in that void between civilization and civilization, in that gap on every map marked only with warnings and question marks. This is the story of the Australian surveyors who entered hell expecting nothing and found something so extraordinary, so mathematically impossible, so geometrically perfect, that it would rewrite everything science thought it knew about deserts, about wind, about the patient artistry of nature over millions of years. This is the story of men who were ridiculed, dismissed, and nearly destroyed by their obsession to count what everyone else thought was uncountable. And when they finally emerged from that furnace with their answer, when they stood before the scientific establishment and declared their findings, the silence in that room was deafening. Because what they found wasn't just sand dunes. What they discovered was something that would challenge the arrogance of educated men who thought they understood Earth's landscapes, something that would humble the cynics who believed there were no more wonders left to document, something so precisely organized that it seemed almost designed by an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Meet Ted Colson. If you passed him on the street in Adelaide in 1929, you wouldn't give him a second glance. Medium height, weathered skin from years working outdoors, calloused hands, a quiet voice that rarely rose above a conversational tone. He wore the same threadbare jacket to the surveyor's office every day. He brought his lunch in a tin box his wife packed each morning. He was, by every measure, the world cared about, utterly ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of man who society trains you to look past, to dismiss, to forget the moment he leaves your field of vision. But Ted Colson possessed something that all the university degrees and family connections and social status in the world couldn't manufacture. He possessed an almost supernatural patience, a capacity to observe what others missed, a humility that allowed him to listen when the land spoke, rather than imposing his assumptions onto it. He'd grown up in the rural outback, the son of a sheep station worker who taught him something the prestigious schools never could. Son, his father had told him when he was barely 10 years old. Educated men come out here and tell us how things are. But the land don't care about their books. The land's been here longer than any human words. If you want to understand it, you don't talk. You listen. Ted had spent 2 decades listening, working as a surveyor's assistant, then as a junior surveyor, then finally earning his credentials through correspondence courses, while his more privileged colleagues fast-tracked through university programs funded by their father's money. He'd mapped mining claims in Western Australia, charted cattle station boundaries in Queensland, documented water sources in South Australia's marginal lands. He knew heat. He knew thirst. He knew what it meant when the land went quiet in a particular way that signaled danger most men wouldn't recognize, until it was too late. And now, in 1930, the government needed someone to finally, properly map the Simpson Desert. The problem was, nobody wanted the job. It wasn't just dangerous. It was professionally pointless. Map a desert? For what? There were no minerals worth mining, no land worth settling, no resources worth extracting. It was a bureaucratic box to tick, a formality, a job that would earn you nothing but sunstroke and mockery. Except Ted Colson volunteered. The reaction in Samyatyabons, the Surveyor General's office, was immediate and predictable. Laughter. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive. The kind of laughter reserved for simpletons who don't understand the joke everyone else gets. Ted, his supervisor said, barely concealing his condescension, why would you waste your time? We need accurate surveyors on projects that matter. Mining developments, township expansions, infrastructure. This desert project, it's just so we can tell the politicians we did it. Send some junior. Nobody with a compass. Let them write mostly flat sand and be done with it. But Ted had heard something different in the brief. Something others had missed because they'd been too busy dismissing the assignment. The indigenous guides who occasionally worked with surveyors had mentioned something strange about that desert. They didn't have a word for it in English, but they gestured in a specific way, describing parallel paths, ancient roads carved by wind, patterns that repeated across impossible distances. Most surveyors had ignored this as primitive superstition. Ted had filed it away as data. "I'll do it properly," Ted said quietly. "Whatever's out there deserves to be properly documented." Deserves? His supervisor laughed again. "Ted, it's sand. Sand doesn't deserve anything. It just sits there being useless. Then there's no harm in letting me try." They approved his request mostly because it solved a problem. They needed someone to officially complete the mapping project, and if humble, foolish Ted Colson wanted to roast himself in Australia's most inhospitable landscape, well, that was his funeral. Literally, if things went wrong. The scientific establishment was even less kind. When Ted presented his expedition plan to the Royal Geographical Society, seeking minimal funding for supplies, the reception was glacial. Dr. Harrison Whitmore, a geologist who'd never actually visited a desert, but had written extensively about them from his comfortable Melbourne office, led the opposition. "Mr. Colson," Whitmore said, pronouncing the Mr. with just enough emphasis to highlight Ted's lack of doctorate, "deserts are, by definition, geographically uninteresting. Wind and sand create random, chaotic formations. There's no pattern, no structure worth documenting. You're proposing we fund an expedition to count, what exactly? Random piles of sand?" "The indigenous peoples suggest there might be unusual formations," Ted replied evenly. "The indigenous peoples," another society member interjected. "A man named Pemberton, whose family wealth came from pastoral lands stolen from those same indigenous peoples, have many colorful stories. Dreamtime mythology is fascinating from an anthropological perspective, but it's hardly scientific data." The room tittered with polite, educated laughter. The kind of laughter that's worse than mockery because it's wrapped in courtesy, making you feel insane for being offended by it. "We also have some aerial reconnaissance photographs," Ted continued, refusing to be derailed. "From the mail route flights. They show linear features." "Linear features," Whitmore repeated, as if tasting something distasteful. "Mr. Colson, shadows and sand create all sorts of optical illusions from the air. You're asking us to fund an expedition based on grainy photographs that probably show nothing more than afternoon sun angle effects. But there was someone else in that room, someone who hadn't spoken yet. Dr. Margaret Chen, one of only 3 female geologists in Australia, a woman who'd fought her own battles with this same establishment, who'd published groundbreaking work on coastal erosion patterns only to watch male colleagues receive credit and academic positions while she remained a perpetual research assistant. She'd been sitting quietly in the back, but now she leaned forward. "May I see those photographs?" Ted handed them over. The room watched with barely concealed impatience as Dr. Chen studied them under the light. The silence stretched. Someone coughed. Finally, she looked up. "These parallel features," she said slowly. "They're too regular to be random shadows. If what I'm seeing is accurate, this would suggest organized dune formations across a massive area. That shouldn't be possible with the prevailing wind data we have." "Exactly," Whitmore jumped in. "It shouldn't be possible, therefore it isn't. The photographs are unclear, probably damaged, certainly misleading." "Or," Dr. Chen said, her voice quiet but firm, "our wind data is incomplete. Or our understanding of large-scale aeolian processes is flawed. Doesn't scientific inquiry demand we investigate anomalies rather than dismiss them?" The tension in the room shifted. This wasn't just about Ted anymore. This was about something deeper, about who got to decide what questions were worth asking, what discoveries were worth pursuing. The society will not fund a wild expedition into one of the continent's most dangerous regions based on unclear photographs and the enthusiasm of... Whitmore paused, choosing his words carefully. Well-meaning but inexperienced personnel. Ted should have been crushed. He'd been called inexperienced after 20 years of fieldwork because he lacked the right university pedigree. He'd been dismissed, patronized, and professionally humiliated in front of Australia's geographical elite. But as he gathered his materials and prepared to leave that oak-paneled room, something unexpected happened. Dr. Chen approached him. "Mr. Colson," she said quietly, "I have a small personal research budget. It's not much, but it would cover basic supplies and provisions. I'd like to fund your expedition, not as charity but as investment in actual discovery. Why? Ted asked, genuinely confused. She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd fought this same battle too many times. Because every significant discovery I've made happened when I investigated something. The establishment assured me wasn't worth investigating, and because those photographs show something real, I can feel it. 3 months later, Ted Colson stood at the edge of the Simpson Desert with a small team, basic surveying equipment, 3 Aboriginal guides who knew the rare water sources, and enough supplies for 8 weeks. The town of Birdsville, the last outpost of civilization, watched them depart with the same expression you'd give someone walking willingly toward certain death. Counting sand dunes, one pub regular muttered into his beer. Stupidest thing I ever heard. The first week was exactly what everyone expected. Brutal heat that exceeded 50 degrees Celsius in the sun. Equipment malfunctioning. Water consumption twice what they'd calculated. The sand was red, iron-rich, and it got into everything. Food, water, instruments, wounds that refused to heal properly in the dry heat. 2 team members wanted to turn back. The guides warned that they were approaching the edge of known water sources. But on day 9, they crested what Ted thought was just another rise in the landscape. And stopped. Before them, stretching from north to south as far as the eye could see, were parallel ridges of sand. Not random humps or chaotic piles. Parallel ridges. Perfectly aligned. Geometric. Deliberate. My God, one team member whispered. Ted felt something he'd never experienced before in 2 decades of surveying. Not excitement, not vindication, but something closer. To religious awe. The humility of standing before something so vast, so ancient, so incomprehensibly organized that it reduced all human achievement to dust. We need to count them, he said quietly. Count what? Someone asked. They go on forever. Then we keep counting until they don't. And so began the most methodical, exhausting, mind-breaking work any of them had ever attempted. They couldn't use vehicles. The dunes were too steep, the sand too soft. They walked. They climbed. Every dune was documented, measured, recorded. Height, length, orientation, composition. Ted developed a system. They'd traverse perpendicular to the dune orientation, counting each ridge as they crossed it, taking detailed measurements at regular intervals. The indigenous guides watched this obsessive documentation with what might have been amusement, or might have been concern. One elder, a man named Billy, finally spoke in his limited English. You trying to count the work of ancestors? The land making. Itself? I'm trying to understand it, Ted replied. Billy nodded slowly. Understanding is different from counting. But you do what you need to do, Ted. The land, it'll teach you. Days became weeks. The count climbed. 50 dunes, 100, 200. The team's disbelief turned to exhaustion, turned to something like madness. The same pattern repeated endlessly. Climb, measure, descend, document, move forward, repeat. Some dunes were 30 meters high. Some stretched for 100 kilometers in length. All of them ran parallel, aligned almost perfectly north-south, shaped by winds that had blown consistently from the east for millions of years. At night, sitting by small fires, the team would look at their data and struggle to process it. This wasn't random, this wasn't chaos, this was organization on a scale that seemed to defy natural processes. One team member, a young surveyor named Wick, voiced what everyone was thinking. It's like someone planned this. Like, something designed it. Ted shook his head. Nature designed it. Wind and time and physics we probably don't fully understand yet. But the order is real. That's what matters. The order is real. 500 dunes. 600. The supplies were running low. The team was exhausted beyond anything they'd experienced. Wick developed severe dehydration and had to be evacuated by the guides to the nearest station. Another member's feet were so damaged by the constant climbing that he could barely walk. Ted himself had lost nearly 15 kilograms, his face gaunt, his lips cracked and bleeding, his hands trembling from exhaustion when he tried to write in his journal each night. But he wouldn't stop. Ted, one of the remaining team members said on day 43. We have to turn back. We're out of time. We're almost out of water. We've proven the point. There are organized dunes here. That's enough. How many have we counted? 793. Then we keep going. Ted, we'll die out here. And for the first time in the entire expedition, Ted Colson raised his voice. Do you understand what we're documenting? Do you comprehend what this means? Every geologist, every scientist, every educated expert told us there was nothing here worth seeing. They dismissed this place as meaningless emptiness. But it's not empty. It's not meaningless. It's one of the most extraordinarily organized natural structures on Earth. And if we don't count it properly, if we don't document it completely, those same experts will dismiss our partial findings as exaggeration or error. We count them all, every single one, because this desert deserves to have its truth told. The silence that followed was profound. They were 50 miles from the nearest water source, exhausted beyond reason, documenting something most of the world would never see or care about. But Ted's words had reframed everything. This wasn't about pride or stubbornness. This was about bearing witness, about refusing to let something magnificent be dismissed simply because it was difficult to see. They pushed on. 800 dunes. 900. The landscape started to subtly change. The dunes gradually decreased in frequency as they approached the desert's western edge. 1,000 dunes. 1,050. Each one documented with the same meticulous care as the first, even though every movement was agony, even though the team was running on nothing but determination and the last reserves of human endurance. On day 56, they counted dune number 1,110. And then, ahead of them, the landscape shifted. The parallel ridges gave way to different terrain. They'd reached the other side. They'd crossed the entire Simpson Desert. And they'd counted every major dune. The journey back nearly killed them. They had to be rescued by a search party sent from Birdsville when they missed their expected return date. Ted Colson was carried into town on a stretcher, barely conscious, clutching his waterproof journal containing 56 days of precise measurements and observations. The local doctor declared it the stupidest, most pointless near-death experience he'd ever treated. Ted recovered slowly. His body had been pushed beyond its limits, but his mind was racing. The data was extraordinary. 1,110 dunes running parallel across 176,000 square kilometers, aligned with mathematical precision, creating one of the largest and most organized dune fields on the planet. This wasn't just a geographic curiosity, this was evidence of large-scale geomorphological processes that science barely understood. He wrote his report. Detailed, methodical, accompanied by measurements and photographs and meticulous documentation. He submitted it to the Surveyor General's office, who filed it away with barely a glance. He sent copies to the Royal Geographical Society, hoping for vindication, for recognition, for some acknowledgement that his expedition had discovered something genuinely significant. The response from Dr. Harrison Whitmore came 3 weeks later. It was a single page, dismissive and cruel. Mr. Colson's supposed discovery of organized dune structures is, at best, an exaggeration of minor geomorphological features, and at worst, a fabrication designed to justify an expensive and pointless expedition. His claim of counting over 1,100 individual dunes strains credulity. Such organized structures would require wind patterns and temporal stability that simply don't exist in arid environments. We must conclude that Mr. Colson, while perhaps well-intentioned, lacks the scientific training to properly interpret his observations. The Society sees no merit in these findings and recommends no further waste of resources on this matter. Ted read the letter in his small Adelaide home, sitting at his kitchen table while his wife watched with concern. For the first time since the expedition, he felt something close to despair. Not because he doubted his data. He knew what he'd seen, what he'd measured, what he'd documented with precision that would satisfy any honest scientific inquiry. But because he understood, perhaps for the first time, how deeply the establishment was invested in dismissing anything that didn't come from the right people, in the right way, with the right credentials. "What will you do?" his wife asked quietly. "I don't know," Ted admitted. "I thought truth would be enough. I thought if I did the work properly, if I brought back real data, it would speak for itself." "Maybe," she said, touching his shoulder gently. "You need to speak for it instead." 3 months later, the Royal Geographical Society held its annual public lecture series in Melbourne. These events were prestigious affairs, attended by scientists, journalists, politicians, and Melbourne's educated elite. Dr. Harrison Whitmore was scheduled to deliver the keynote address. The Mythology of Australian Deserts, Separating Scientific Fact from Popular Fiction. Nobody noticed when Ted Colson entered the hall and took a seat in the back row. He wore his best suit, mended and cleaned. The same suit he'd worn to his own wedding 15 years earlier. He carried a leather satchel containing his journal, his photographs, and his measurements. Whitmore's lecture was exactly what Ted expected. Polished, confident, dismissive. He spoke about how popular, Imagination romanticized deserts, how people wanted to believe in hidden wonders and mysterious formations. How actual scientific analysis revealed deserts to be exactly what common sense suggested. Chaotic, random, geographically uninteresting accumulations of wind-blown sand. There have been recent claims, Whitmore said, and Ted felt the entire room's attention shift slightly, of so-called organized dune fields in the Simpson Desert. These claims stem from an expedition led by a surveyor, with, shall we say, more enthusiasm than training. While we appreciate civic dedication to government projects, we must maintain scientific rigor. The Simpson Desert is no different from any other major desert, random, chaotic, and geologically unexceptional. The audience nodded. This made sense. This confirmed what they already believed. That's when Ted stood up. May I respond to that? The room went silent. Every head turned. Whitmore's expression moved from confusion to recognition to irritation in the space of 3 seconds. Mr. Colson, he said, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. This is a professional scientific lecture, not a public forum for... For what? Ted interrupted, his quiet voice somehow carrying through the hall. For people who've actually been there? For surveyors who've spent 2 decades documenting Australian geography? For men who nearly died collecting the data you're dismissing without ever examining? The tension in the room became palpable. This wasn't how these events went. The audience, the journalists, the society members, they were accustomed to polite academic discourse, not direct confrontation. I've examined your so-called data, Whitmore said coldly. Your measurements are either exaggerated or incompetent. No surveyor worth his credentials would claim to have counted over 1,100 individual dunes. It's geologically absurd. Is it? Ted walked forward slowly, down the center aisle. Or is it geologically unprecedented? There's a difference, Dr. Whitmore. Unprecedented means it hasn't been documented before. Absurd means it can't exist. Which are you claiming? I'm claiming, Whitmore said, his voice rising, that your expedition was a waste of resources that produced unreliable results. You lacked the scientific training to properly interpret geomorphological data. You counted sand humps and called them a discovery. It's embarrassing. Some audience members nodded. Others looked uncertain. This was becoming uncomfortable. Dr. Whitmore, Ted said, and his voice was still quiet, still controlled. You've published 17 papers on desert geology. I've read them all. They're very well written, very convincing. But there's something curious I noticed. You cite observations from the Sahara, from the Gobi, from the Atacama, all second-hand accounts from other researchers. In your entire distinguished career, how many deserts have you personally visited? Whitmore's face flushed. My research is based on established scientific literature and proper academic methodology, not anecdotal field experiences. So none, Ted said. You've never actually stood in a desert, never felt how wind moves across open sand, never watched how dune formations evolve with the daily temperature shifts. You've built your entire reputation on analyzing other people's observations from your comfortable office in Melbourne. The crowd stirred. This was getting personal, ugly. How dare you? Whitmore sputtered. My credentials, my position, mean nothing to the sand. Ted finished. The Simpson Desert doesn't care about your PhD, Dr. Whitmore. It doesn't care about your publications or your position in the society. It exists in a specific way, with specific formations, regardless of whether you believe in it or not. I spent 56 days documenting those formations. I nearly died doing it. And you're dismissing that work because it doesn't fit your theories? Your documentation is unreliable. Why? The single word cut through Whitmore's rising anger. Because I counted something you thought couldn't be counted? Because I found organization where you predicted chaos? Or because I'm just a surveyor, not a doctor, not part of your academic circle, not the right kind of person to make discoveries? The silence in that hall was absolute. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Ted continued, his voice soft but relentless. You can't accept that someone, like me, someone who learned by doing instead of by reading, someone who built his expertise through decades of fieldwork instead of university connections, might have observed something you missed. It's not about the data. It's about protecting your position, your authority, your right to decide what counts as knowledge. Whitmore looked around desperately, seeking support from the society president, from his colleagues, from anyone. But the room was silent, waiting. I have photographs, Teddy said, opening his satchel. Measurements. 37 notebooks documenting every major dune we crossed. Compass bearings showing the consistent alignment. Calculations of the dune field's total area. The names of 3 Aboriginal guides who've known about these formations for generations but whose knowledge doesn't count as scientific to people like you. And I have something else. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a letter. This is from Dr. Margaret Chen. Perhaps you remember her. Dr. Whitmore, the geologist whose coastal erosion research you cited extensively in your paper on wind patterns. The research you cited without properly crediting her as the primary researcher? Whitmore went pale. Dr. Chen has examined my data, Ted continued. She's verified my measurements using the mathematical models she developed, the same models you've used in your own work. And she's concluded that the Simpson Desert dune field represents one of the most significant geomorphological discoveries of the 20th century. She's preparing a paper on it now, for publication in the Journal of Arid Environments. With my name as co-author, the room erupted in murmurs. This was a twist nobody had anticipated. But Ted wasn't done. Dr. Whitmore, you called my work embarrassing. You suggested I lack scientific training. You dismissed me because I'm not part of your world, because I don't have the right credentials, because my knowledge came from doing instead of from books. But there's something you don't know about me. Something I've never mentioned because it's never seemed relevant until now.